You have 30 days to decide whether you want to leave peacefully, because this land will soon belong to the community. Those were the words that changed everything. I still remember standing at the edge of my property that morning, holding a cup of coffee in my hand while the cold November air moved through the tall trees around my 18 acres of family land. The smell of damp earth mixed with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the birds above me and the gravel shifting beneath my boots. Then I saw the sign. A new HOA notice had been placed near my front gate, right where anyone driving past could see it. It was clean, official-looking, and carefully designed to make it appear like the decision had already been made. Standing beside it was Caroline Bennett, the president of Willow Creek Estates HOA. She wore a perfectly fitted blazer, carried a folder full of documents, and looked at my property like she was already planning what would happen to it next. What she did not know was that the biggest mistake she made was believing I was just another homeowner who would step aside when someone with a title told me to move. My name is Daniel Whitaker, and for most people in Willow Creek Estates, I was simply the quiet man who lived on the edge of the neighborhood. I fixed things around my property, maintained the old wooden fence, and spent my mornings walking the same land my family had protected for generations. I was never the person looking for attention. I never attended every HOA meeting. I never argued with neighbors over small issues. I just wanted to preserve the place that carried my family's memories. My grandfather bought this land decades ago when the area was mostly open fields and country roads. Back then, there were no expensive homes nearby, no community gates, and no HOA rules telling people how everything should look. There was just the land, the old farmhouse, and a family promise to take care of it. That promise meant more to me than any number written on a property appraisal. Caroline did not see it that way. To her, my land was an opportunity. The HOA had plans for expansion, and my property was the missing piece they wanted. She told me it would improve the neighborhood. She said everyone would benefit. But every time I asked a simple question about ownership, authority, or documentation, the conversation changed. That was when I realized this was not about improving anything. It was about control. Over the next few weeks, Caroline sent letters, notices, and requests that became more aggressive in tone. Each one carried the same message. The HOA expected cooperation. But there was one thing Caroline did not understand. I had spent my entire life paying attention to details. I kept records. I remembered conversations. I saved every document connected to my property. My grandfather taught me something important when I was young. He said, "A person who knows the history of something can protect it better than someone who only sees its value." I never forgot those words. Caroline believed she had already won because she had the authority of the HOA behind her. She believed a title and a stack of paperwork were enough to control the situation. She had no idea that beneath the quiet life I built was a history she never bothered to discover. She had no idea about the one phone call I was keeping in reserve. And she definitely did not know that the moment she claimed my land was the moment she started creating the evidence that would change everything. The first thing I noticed was not the letter itself. It was the silence that came with it. When someone believes they have complete control, they usually stop explaining. They stop asking questions. They simply expect everyone else to follow. That was exactly how Caroline Bennett operated. 3 days after she placed the HOA notice near my gate, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. The morning was quiet, with sunlight spreading across the fields behind my house and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from my kitchen. I opened the envelope at my dining table, the same table my grandfather built by hand decades ago. Inside were several pages filled with official language, community references, and carefully chosen words that made the situation sound more complicated than it really was. The HOA claimed my property was creating concerns for the neighborhood. They mentioned future improvements, shared access, and community standards. Every sentence sounded reasonable if you read it quickly. That was the point. Confusing language can make people accept things they would normally question. But I did not read documents quickly. I never had. I spent years learning that the smallest detail is often the most important one. I walked into my office, placed the papers on my desk, and started reviewing every page. My office was nothing fancy. A wooden bookshelf, an old desk, a few family photographs, and the filing cabinet I had kept for years. But inside that filing cabinet was the history of my property. Receipts, maps, previous agreements, maintenance records. Every piece of information that showed where my family's land began and ended. As I compared the HOA documents with my own records, I noticed something strange. The HOA was not claiming ownership directly. They were trying to create the impression that they had authority over decisions involving my land. There was a difference, and that difference mattered. That afternoon, I drove through Willow Creek Estates and watched how people reacted to the situation. Some neighbors waved like they always did. Others looked away. I understood why. Nobody wants to become the person who challenges a system everyone else has accepted. Caroline had built her reputation around being organized and confident. To many people, that looked like leadership. But I had learned something throughout my life. Confidence is not the same as being correct. A few days later, Caroline invited me to the HOA office. The building was exactly how I expected it to be. Clean floors, perfect decorations, framed photos showing community events and achievements. Everything was designed to communicate authority. Caroline sat behind her desk with the same calm expression she had at my gate. "Daniel, I hope you understand we are trying to do what is best for everyone," she said. I looked at the documents in front of her. "I understand that. What I want to understand is where this authority comes from." Her expression changed slightly. It was only for a moment, but I noticed. She expected disagreement. She did not expect questions. She explained that the HOA had long-term plans and that cooperation would make things easier for everyone. I listened carefully. Then I asked about the specific records supporting those claims. She changed the subject. That was when I became certain. This was not a simple misunderstanding. Someone had a plan, and they expected nobody to look closely enough to find the weak points. When I returned home that evening, I walked past the old fence my grandfather built and looked across the land that had been part of my family's story for so long. Caroline thought she was dealing with someone who did not know how to fight back. She did not understand that I was not looking for a fight. I was looking for the truth, and the truth was already starting to reveal itself. The next morning, I found another envelope waiting beside my front door. This time, I already knew what it was before I opened it. The pattern had become clear. Caroline Bennett was not trying to have a conversation with me anymore. She was building a case, piece by piece, hoping that enough official-looking paperwork would make everyone believe she had the right to control my property. I carried the envelope inside, placed it on the kitchen counter, and looked out the window toward the fields behind my house. The morning sun stretched across the land, touching the old fence posts and the trees my grandfather planted decades ago. This property had always been a place of peace for me. Now, every document from the HOA felt like a reminder that someone wanted to change that. Inside the envelope was a formal request for property access. The HOA wanted to conduct what they called a community compliance review. They wanted to inspect parts of my land, review how I maintained it, and evaluate whether future changes would fit their standards. I read the letter slowly. Then I read it again. The words were polite, but the message was clear. They were testing how much control they could claim. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I did what I had always done. I gathered information. I went through every document connected to my property. I reviewed old county records, family paperwork, and every communication I had received from the HOA. The more I looked, the more I noticed a pattern. Caroline was not making random decisions. She was following a plan. The HOA had been preparing for a larger development project, and my property stood directly in the way of their vision. They wanted access to my land because it connected two areas they hoped to improve. But wanting something and having the legal right to take control of it were two completely different things. Later that week, I attended another HOA meeting. I decided it was important to listen, not argue. The clubhouse was filled with residents sitting in neat rows of chairs. Caroline stood at the front of the room, presenting the future plans with confidence. She talked about growth, improvements, and protecting property values. To anyone hearing it for the first time, it sounded like a positive community project. Then she mentioned my property. She described it as an important piece of the neighborhood's future. That was the moment I realized she had already told the story she wanted everyone to believe. She had made my land part of a plan before she had my agreement. After the meeting, I spoke with a few neighbors. Some admitted they did not know the HOA was trying to expand its control. Others said they assumed everything was already approved because Caroline spoke with so much certainty. That was the danger of someone who always sounded confident. People started confusing confidence with truth. That evening, I sat in my office with the old filing cabinet open beside me. I looked through the documents my grandfather had saved and the records I had maintained over the years. There was something comforting about seeing all that history in front of me. It reminded me that I was not just protecting a piece of land. I was protecting a promise. I knew Caroline believed this was becoming a simple victory for the HOA. She believed every letter she sent moved her closer to control. But what she did not realize was that every letter, every request, and every decision was creating a record. And records have a way of telling the truth, especially when someone believes nobody is paying attention. The pressure increased faster than I expected. Not because Caroline Bennett had discovered something new, but because she realized I was not reacting the way she wanted. People who rely on control often become more aggressive when they stop receiving the response they expect. They look for another way to create pressure. That was exactly what happened next. On Monday morning, I found a notice attached to my mailbox informing me that the HOA had scheduled a formal property review. The wording was careful, almost friendly, but the meaning was obvious. They wanted to create a situation where their authority appeared normal. They wanted everyone watching to believe this was just another routine process. I stood there holding the paper while the wind moved through the trees around my property. The same land that had been in my family for decades was suddenly being treated like a community project waiting for approval. I walked back inside and placed the notice next to the others. Then I opened my notebook and started writing down every detail. Dates, conversations, requests, names. I had learned a long time ago that memory can fade, but records do not. That afternoon, Caroline arrived at my property with 2 HOA board members. She stepped out of her vehicle with the same confident expression she always carried. She looked around at the fields, the old fence, and the house as if she was already imagining what changes could be made. "Daniel, we are here to make sure everything is handled properly," she said. I looked at the documents in her hand. Properly according to which rule? I asked. The question was simple, but it changed the tone immediately. Caroline began explaining that the HOA had responsibilities to protect the community. She talked about consistency, standards, and future planning. I listened carefully. Then I asked where those specific powers were written in the official records. One of the board members looked down at the papers. Caroline paused before answering. It was a small moment, but it confirmed what I had already suspected. They had prepared the message. They had prepared the presentation, but they had not prepared for someone to examine the foundation underneath it. After they left, I drove to the county records office. The building was quiet, with the familiar smell of old paper and polished floors. I sat at a public table surrounded by folders and documents, searching through the history of Willow Creek Estates. I was not looking for a way to attack anyone. I was looking for clarity. After several hours, I found something important. The HOA documents referenced certain areas as if they had authority over them, but the official property records told a different story. There were gaps. There were assumptions. There were details that had never been properly connected. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the pages in front of me. Caroline had spent years building confidence around her position. She believed people would accept what she said because she was the HOA president. But a title does not create ownership. A position does not replace proof. That evening, I returned home and walked across my property as the sun began to set. The orange light covered the fields, and the quiet sound of the wind moved through the trees. I thought about calling someone. I thought about revealing everything I knew. But I stopped myself. Not yet. There was still something I needed to confirm. Because the most important part of the truth was not what I knew. It was who else had the information that Caroline never expected me to find. That night, I sat alone in my office with the county records spread across my desk. The only light in the room came from the lamp beside my chair, casting a warm glow over the old documents, handwritten notes, and family photographs surrounding me. Outside, the wind moved through the trees on my property, the same trees my grandfather planted when this land was still surrounded by open fields. For the first time since Caroline Bennett began challenging my ownership, I knew I was close to understanding the full picture. But I also knew something important. Information alone was not enough. The right information, in the right hands, at the right moment, was what changed everything. I opened the oldest folder in my filing cabinet. The edges of the papers were worn, and the ink had faded slightly over the years, but every document had been carefully preserved. My grandfather believed that records were a form of protection. He always said that memories could be questioned, but documentation could speak for itself. Inside that folder were property maps, old agreements, and correspondence connected to the original purchase of the land. I compared those documents with the newer HOA records Caroline had provided. Slowly, the connection became clear. The HOA was not simply trying to manage the neighborhood. They were trying to expand their influence beyond what had ever been officially approved. The more I looked, the more I realized Caroline was depending on one thing. She believed nobody would take the time to investigate. She believed most people would see the HOA letterhead, hear the confident explanation, and accept the story without asking deeper questions. She was right about one thing. Most people did not have the time or patience to look closely. But I did. The next morning, I returned to the county records office with one specific goal. I needed to confirm a detail I had discovered in the old documents. The clerk brought out additional files related to the original neighborhood development. I spent hours reviewing the information, comparing dates and signatures. Then I found what I had been looking for. There was a missing connection between the HOA's current claims and the original property agreements. The authority Caroline was presenting as established had never been properly transferred. It was not a matter of opinion. It was a matter of documentation. I closed the folder slowly and sat there for a moment. I thought about the easiest path forward. I could have immediately confronted Caroline. I could have shown her everything I discovered and demanded answers. But that would only give her time to create another explanation. Instead, I decided to do something different. I was going to let her continue believing she was in control. Because people reveal the most when they believe they are winning. When I returned home, I walked into my office and looked at the old phone sitting on my desk. It was the same phone I had used for years, simple and reliable. I picked it up for a moment, then placed it back down. The person I needed to contact was someone I had not spoken to in a long time. Someone who understood the history behind these documents and knew exactly why they mattered. The call was not about asking for help. It was about confirming the truth. And once that truth was confirmed, Caroline Bennett would no longer be fighting a quiet homeowner. She would be facing the facts she never expected to find. The phone sat on my desk for almost an hour before I finally picked it up. Not because I was uncertain, but because I understood the importance of timing. A single conversation can change the direction of a situation, but only if the person making the call knows exactly what they need to say. I looked out the office window at my property, watching the afternoon sunlight move across the fields. For decades, this land had been a place of quiet moments, family gatherings, and memories. Now it had become the center of a battle over control. I reached for the phone and dialed a number I had not called in years. The person who answered was someone who had been connected to my family's property history long before Willow Creek Estates existed. His name was Robert Hayes, a retired property records specialist who had helped my grandfather organize important documents when the area was first being developed. I did not call him because I needed someone to fight for me. I called because I needed someone who could confirm what the records already suggested. "Daniel, it has been a long time," Robert said. I smiled when I heard his voice. "It has," I replied. "I need your help understanding something about the original property agreements." For the next several minutes, I explained what the HOA had been doing. I described the notices, the access requests, and the claims Caroline Bennett had been making. Robert listened carefully without interrupting. Then there was a pause, a meaningful one. "Daniel, are you sure they are saying they have authority over your land?" he asked. "That is exactly what they are suggesting," I answered. His response confirmed what I had already suspected. The original agreements did not give the HOA the control they were trying to claim. The documents they were using only applied to certain community areas, not privately owned property like mine. Robert explained that there were archived records from the early development plans that clearly showed the boundaries. The HOA had grown over the years, but the authority had never expanded with it. They had simply acted as if it had. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment. The room felt different. Not because I suddenly had power, but because I finally had confirmation. The truth had been there the entire time. It was just buried under years of assumptions and paperwork. The next morning, I prepared everything carefully. I organized the documents, created copies, and wrote a clear response to the HOA. I did not make accusations. I did not use emotional language. I simply presented facts. That was always the strongest approach. When Caroline received my response, she called me within the day. Her voice sounded different from before. The certainty she once carried had been replaced with questions. "Daniel, where did you get this information?" she asked. I looked at the documents on my desk before answering. "I looked at the records," I said. That was all I needed to say. She did not know about Robert. She did not know about the original agreements. She did not know that every step she had taken had created a clearer picture of what was happening. Caroline believed she had been moving toward a victory, but she had actually been building the foundation for her own mistake. And now, for the first time, she was beginning to realize that the quiet homeowner she underestimated had been preparing for this moment from the very beginning. The day after I sent my response to the HOA, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet, and the first light of morning came through the kitchen window, covering the wooden table with a soft golden glow. I made my coffee, walked into my office, and looked at the stack of documents sitting neatly on my desk. A few weeks earlier, those papers represented a problem I needed to solve. Now they represented something different. They represented the truth. I knew Caroline Bennett would not simply accept what happened. People who build their confidence around control rarely give it up easily. They usually look for one last way to protect the image they created. That was exactly what happened later that afternoon when the HOA announced an emergency community meeting. The message was simple. They wanted to discuss concerns regarding my property and the future of Willow Creek Estates. But I knew the real reason. Caroline wanted the room back on her side. She wanted the community to hear her explanation before they heard the facts. When I arrived at the clubhouse, the atmosphere felt different from previous meetings. Residents who once avoided getting involved were now paying attention. Some looked at the documents I carried. Others quietly talked among themselves. They were no longer just listening. They were questioning. Caroline stood at the front of the room, dressed professionally, with her usual confident posture. She began by talking about community growth, neighborhood standards, and the importance of cooperation. To someone who did not know the details, it sounded reasonable. But then she mentioned my property again. She described it as an obstacle to future plans. That was when I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not make accusations. I simply placed the documents on the table in front of the board. "I think everyone deserves to see the complete information," I said. The room became quiet. I explained the original property boundaries. I explained the difference between community responsibility and private ownership. I showed the records that confirmed the HOA never had the authority they claimed. The most important part was not what I said. It was what the documents showed. One by one, the board members reviewed the paperwork. They compared the HOA claims with the official records. Questions started coming from the people who had once remained silent. "Why were we never shown these documents?" one resident asked. Another questioned why the HOA had presented assumptions as if they were already established rules. Caroline tried to respond, but the conversation had changed. For the first time, she was no longer controlling the story. She was answering questions about it. I watched carefully as the same confidence that once filled the room began to disappear. Not because anyone was attacking her, because facts have a way of changing the atmosphere when they are finally placed in front of everyone. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me. Some apologized for believing the first version of the story. Others simply thanked me for taking the time to look deeper. I told them the same thing I had always believed. This was never about winning an argument. It was about making sure the truth had a chance to be heard. As I walked back to my truck that evening, I looked across the neighborhood and then back at my property. Caroline had spent months believing she was taking control, but she never understood the one thing that mattered most. Authority can create attention, but only truth creates trust. And now everyone in Willow Creek Estates was finally seeing the difference. The days following the HOA meeting were unlike anything I had experienced since this situation began. For the first time, the conversations around Willow Creek Estates were not controlled by one voice. People were asking questions. They were reviewing documents. They were looking beyond appearances and paying attention to the details that had been ignored for too long. I could feel the change every time I walked through the neighborhood. A simple wave from a neighbor felt different. A short conversation at the mailbox felt different. The community was beginning to understand that the issue was never just about my property. It was about how easily people can accept authority without asking where that authority comes from. Caroline Bennett, however, was not ready to let go. A week after the meeting, she requested a private conversation with me at the clubhouse. When I arrived, she was sitting at the same desk where she had once explained the HOA rules with complete confidence. The room looked exactly the same, but the feeling had changed. The framed community photos on the walls, the organized paperwork, and the polished office no longer created the same impression. "Daniel, I think things have become more complicated than they needed to be," she said. I listened quietly. She talked about misunderstandings, communication problems, and how everyone could move forward if we found a solution. But I noticed something important. She was no longer talking about authority. She was talking about compromise. That told me everything I needed to know. "Caroline," I said, "I was never against working together. I was against decisions being made without the proper authority." She looked down at the documents on her desk. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she admitted that the HOA board needed to review previous decisions. It was not the statement of someone who had won. It was the statement of someone who realized the situation had changed. Over the next several weeks, the HOA began reviewing the records connected to the property claims. The process was slow, but it was necessary. Every document had to be examined. Every decision had to be compared with the official records. The same paperwork that Caroline once used to create confidence was now being used to answer questions. Eventually, the HOA board announced that the property access requests would be withdrawn and the development plans involving my land would be reconsidered. The announcement was brief, but the impact was significant. The pressure that had surrounded my property for months finally disappeared. One evening, I walked along the old fence line as the sun was setting. The same place where Caroline had once stood and explained what she believed would happen was now quiet again. The grass moved gently in the wind, and the familiar sounds of my property returned. I thought about my grandfather and the lessons he left behind. He never told me that protecting something would always be easy. He taught me that protecting something important required patience, preparation, and knowing when to act. Caroline had believed she could take control because she had a position and a title. But she learned something that many people forget. A position can give someone influence, but it cannot replace the truth. The biggest change was not that I kept my land. I already knew I would. The biggest change was seeing my neighbors realize they had the right to ask questions too. Because once people understand that rules should apply equally to everyone, a community becomes stronger. And that was something no HOA document could ever take away. The morning after the HOA board made its final announcement, I woke up before sunrise and walked outside with a cup of coffee in my hand. The air was cool, the sky was still painted with soft shades of blue, and the quiet sound of nature returned to the place I had called home for so many years. I stood near the old wooden fence and looked across the 18 acres of land that had belonged to my family for generations. For months, this view had been connected to uncertainty, paperwork, and pressure. But that morning, it felt different. It felt like home again. I thought about how quickly everything had changed. When Caroline Bennett first arrived at my gate, she believed the situation was already decided. She had a position, a title, and a group of people who trusted her confidence. She believed that was enough to control the outcome. But she overlooked the one thing that mattered most. Facts do not become less important just because someone speaks with authority. The final review of the HOA records confirmed what the documents had shown from the beginning. The HOA had never had the level of control it claimed over my property. The access requests were withdrawn. The plans involving my land were reconsidered. The story that had been presented to the community slowly changed once everyone had access to the complete information. A few weeks later, I attended another HOA meeting. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. There was no tension, no confusion, no one waiting for someone else to explain what was happening. People came prepared with questions and a better understanding of their own rights. Caroline was still there, but she was no longer standing at the front of the room as someone whose words automatically ended the conversation. She was simply another person in the community. After the meeting, she approached me outside the clubhouse. The evening sunlight reflected across the parking lot, and the sound of neighbors talking filled the background. For a moment, we both just stood there quietly. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you?" she asked. I thought about everything that had happened. The letters, the meetings, the documents, the phone call that confirmed what my family records had shown all along. I knew I needed to understand the truth before I made any decisions. I replied. She nodded slowly. There was no argument, no dramatic moment, just the realization that the situation had never been what she thought it was. When I returned home that evening, I opened the old filing cabinet in my office one last time. I looked at the documents my grandfather saved, the records I protected, and the notes from the process that had brought everything to an end. Those papers represented more than ownership. They represented responsibility. They represented the importance of protecting something that mattered. I closed the cabinet and walked back outside. The old fence stood exactly where it always had. The trees moved gently in the wind. The land was quiet again. I realized the greatest victory was not proving someone wrong. It was proving that patience, preparation, and honesty still mattered. Caroline had believed power came from having a title. I learned long ago that real power comes from knowing the truth and having the courage to protect it. My grandfather once told me that land remembers who takes care of it. Standing there under the evening sky, I understood something else. Communities remember too. They remember who tried to control them, and they remember who stood for what was right.